Okay, everybody, today we're going to talk about how the Renaissance spreads out of Italy, mostly through the trade routes, and definitely due to some important technologies that come to place. Most influential of these is the printing press that we will actually talk about in the next video. But today we're going to focus on just how it spread to the rest of Europe. So as the Renaissance begins to flower in Italy, as it gets going in Italy, Northern Europe is still recovering from the Black Death because the Black Death lasted longer in the north and it got to the north later. But by the 1400s, the cities of the north begin to enjoy some economic growth, and they start to have some of the wealth needed to develop their own Renaissance. And this is through many of the same causes of how it came to play in Italy. It just comes a little later. Okay. Northern Renaissance begins in the cities of Flanders, what we would now know as kind of northeastern France and Belgium and the Netherlands. And from there, they're a very important trading enclave there because the ports of modern-day Netherlands and Belgium all access Central Europe, but also the English Channel, the North Sea, and then the Atlantic Ocean. So they spread to Spain, France, and England from there. Many of the painters focus on the common people, some of the scenes creating everyday life, which we looked at when we talked about humanism. And many of the writers also focus on common people, and more importantly, they write it in the vernacular or the local language. Okay? Many of these northern painters focus on realism. They use the oil paints to make the paintings more realistic looking. They use more realistic colors that reflect the light, and they add depth and glow, things that we've talked about already. In the 1400s, the paintings of Van Eyck were filled with rich and realistic detail, and another painter called Peter Bruegel uses vibrant colors to portray scenes of peasant life. Okay, two other major artists. Rubens, he blends the realistic traditions of the Flemish painters with the classical themes of Greece and Rome. He's also a humanist, so he uses many themes from classical history and mythology in his paintings. Then you have Albrecht Dürer, who is a German, and he applies Renaissance painting techniques to engravings in wood. Okay, and they are often portrayed the religious upheaval that comes out of this period of the Renaissance, and they are very realistic looking. Okay. Besides artists, you also have a lot of scholars and writers who stress education, and especially classical learning. Most of these guys are flirting around with religious and moral reform. They begin writing in the local language, the language that people speak, so that people learn to read in their own language. And this writing in the local language appeals to the middle class, to the people that have the money in all of these northern towns and cities. Okay, one of the most famous of these is Erasmus. He is one of the major religious scholars of the age. We're going to dwell on him for a little time in class. He was born in 1466, and he wrote texts on a lot of subjects, including a Greek edition of the Bible. Okay, he calls for a translation of the vernacular into the Bible, which runs him afoul of the Catholic Church. And he is also disturbed by the corruption of the church and seeks to bring about reforms. He's kind of the original reformer of the church that many others that we will get to in the next coming days take up this charge and really force some reform into the church. Sir Thomas More. He's an English humanist. He pushes more for social reforms, and he writes a book called Utopia about an ideal society where everybody's educated and everybody has equal rights. Rabelais is a French humanist who uses comedy and adventure to point out opinions and what needs to be fixed in religion and education. Okay, the towering figure of this age is someone that you're familiar with. I believe you are reading right now Romeo and Juliet or one of the Shakespeare plays in your English classes. Over the span of about 20 years, he writes 37 plays, many of which are performed today. You will read several of them during your high school career. And he explores a lot of ideas, especially focused on complexity of the individual, uses the common language, and he actually adds 1,700 new words to the English language that we speak today. Okay, some other famous writers. Dante Alighieri writes in Italian. His main book was The Divine Comedy. that actually Dan Brown based a book on called I can't remember the name of it, but it was about the journey through heaven to hell. Miguel Cervantes, the writer of Don Quixote, pokes fun at the traditions of chivalry and knighthood. Francesco Petrarch, who we will look at some of his writings in class, is an Italian scholar. He's often considered to be the father of humanism, and his sonnets or poems admired and imitated throughout Europe. And it becomes kind of the model for lyrical poetry. He's also the guy who coins the phrase the Dark Ages to refer to the Middle Ages. Okay, and then finally you have Machiavelli. He writes The Prince, and it's basically a handbook for rulers on how to gain and maintain power. He tells them several things. He says it's better to be feared than loved. The end justifies the means. And he says, and if all men were good, you would not have to behave in this manner. But since some men are wicked, you must be the same to achieve your ends. His book, I have a copy of it. I'll show it to you in class. Really becomes a handbook for the rulers of the age, but later his book is taught in management classes. When I took management classes, we talked about this book and some of the ideas and were they right or wrong for modern management. His work today is seen as a realistic picture of the politics of the time. So while it was written for the kings to tell them how to rule, it comes back to us as a way that we can get some insight into how people ruled during the time. And finally, all this work was important, but it would not have become as widely known if not for the invention of the printing press. And it's really not the invention, it's more the transition of the printing press into Europe and the idea of movable type, which allows for cheaper and more widely dissemination of information. And we will be talking about that in the next video. So make sure your notes are good. Go back and review what you need to, and then submit the Google quiz online.